Our next speaker and his team use creative placemaking to revitalize small towns. They accomplish this using cultural and entrepreneurial concepts to create innovative housing, cultural amenities, and new jobs. Here is Brooke Guffman, Egyptian Electric Cooperative Association's Member Services Manager, to make his introduction.
Good morning. For those of you who had not gotten to hear Zach Mannheimer yet, he holds a dual BA in Theater Arts and Philosophy from Muhlenberg College in Allentown, Pennsylvania. After settling in Des Moines in the fall of 2007, he eventually became the founder of Des Moines Social Club, an arts and educational nonprofit witnessing an unmet need in his community. To expand his work beyond Iowa, he joined McClure Engineering in March of 2017 as their principal community planner. McClure is a Clive, Iowa, civil engineering-based firm that hired Zach to bring in-house focus to community planning and economic development for rural communities in Iowa and surrounding Midwestern states. He's dedicated his career to assist small towns with unique solutions to facilitate economic and population growth. Actionable steps include addressing housing obstacles, Main Street revitalization, thriving community must-haves, and outside-of-the-box concepts to retain and attract young people to rural America. I have come to professionally and personally know Zach and his colleagues as they have begun this same work in one of our very own communities. After listening to his presentation at the 2018 NRACA Connect Conference, I became inspired, as it was something that had already been pressing on my heart and mind. As my husband and I were in the process of acquiring 3 historic buildings in one of our downtowns, but we really didn't have any plans, but for the same reasons. The world loves to tell us that rural America is dying, and specifically the state of Illinois, and I believe differently. He validated my feelings that day and my longing to make a difference in my own community. As an Egyptian Electric Cooperative employee and member services, I, like many cooperative employees and board members, sit on a variety of community service or economic development committees. One that I am a part of specifically is Jackson Growth Alliance, a county-wide economic development board, and they picked up this idea and led the charge in bringing him and his team to Murfreesboro. In less than a year, our organization raised the funds for this project from for-profit businesses, not-for-profit organizations, such as the school district, the City of Murfreesboro, the Tourism Commission, Main Street, and community foundations, as well as individual personal contributors to help cover the entire consultant fees to bring them to Murfreesboro. McClure Engineering is currently at their midpoint in bringing everyone together from all the different organizations to obtain information to create a specific and customized creative placemaking action plan for our Main Street, art, housing, and business communities. Egyptian Electric has graciously supported this project financially and with my time in organizing these endeavors, meeting with community leaders, fundraising, attending community visioning sessions, and leading steering committee meetings. This has also interwoven myself and the cooperative into the works and the people of our community, and I do not plan for this work to stop in Murfreesboro. It has become a true grassroots movement that has encouraged participation and rejuvenated pride. I believe revitalizing small-town America is the next big thing, and although our members don't always reside in these downtown areas, our families, our economic drivers, our schools, and our local governments do. So if we want to commit to our communities in this way, we can lead it and be the change. Please join me in welcoming Zach Mannheimer, Principal Community Planner with McClure Engineering.
Good morning. Thank you, Brooke, for that wonderful welcome. We've really enjoyed our time in Murfreesboro. We've been there, as Brooke said, we're at our midway point right now, and we've done some really interesting work there that I'm going to be highlighting here in a few moments. But I want to start out by asking the basic question, how many of you have heard the term creative placemaking before? Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody. So that's pretty common. Creative placemaking has been around only about 10 years. It was started primarily to help the city of Detroit. about 15 years ago. I'm sure you've all heard about Detroit's decline. And it was, how do we bring back that downtown? And over the last decade, that placemaking practice has largely been used primarily in urban settings. And the work that we do is primarily in rural communities. We define rural as towns of 50,000 people or less. And most of the communities we work in are 10,000 people or less, just like Murfreesboro. So we are all over the country right now. We're working in 18 different states and 1 province of Canada. And I'm going to tell you a bit about that work, but first I want to start off with a little bit of information about me. So I live in Des Moines, Iowa, but I'm originally from Pennsylvania, from Bucks County, where all the history comes from. This is where Washington crossed the Delaware. I grew up in a rural community of 2,500 people. By the time I graduated high school, it ceased to be rural, it got sucked into the Philadelphia metro, and it became suburban. And I watched it lose its individuality my entire childhood. I never really wanted to see that happen again. I went to college, and as Brooke said, I was a theater and philosophy major, so I had absolutely no job prospects when I graduated. I moved to London. I did theater in London for about 2 years. My visa expired. I had to come back to America. I did what every other theater kid did. I went to New York. I lived in Brooklyn for about 8 years, and in New York, I ran theater companies and restaurants and quickly realized the last thing New York needed was another theater or another restaurant. I also looked around myself in Brooklyn, and I saw everybody that looked like me, thought like me, acted like me, played like me, ate like me, and I was in a bubble. And I didn't think that that was very healthy either as an artist or as a human. And I knew I needed to leave, but I wasn't sure where I wanted to go just yet. So over the summer of 2007, I did this ridiculous road trip. I drove to 22 cities around the country. I visited each city for about 3 to 5 days. I was specifically looking for communities that had roughly 500,000 people in the metro, a city that had a downtown that needed to be revitalized, a city that was struggling to attract and retain its young people, a city that had an arts program that was established but not established nationally, and a city that was as close to 50-50 politically as I could find. And Des Moines checked all my boxes. And so in the fall of 2007, I moved to Des Moines. I didn't know a single person in the state of Iowa at the time. Now I've got a wonderful wife and 3 kids, and that's what happens when you move to the Midwest. So I've been in Des Moines now for about 12 years, and the reason why I moved there, as Brooke mentioned, was to start a nonprofit called the Des Moines Social Club. The Social Club is based in downtown Des Moines. We opened the Social Club in 2009. And just to give you a little bit of information on it, today the Social Club sees about 300,000 people a year come through its doors. It produces well over 800 different events in every single artistic discipline every year. Inside, this is the headquarters here. It's Fire Station Number 1, a 1937 Art Deco firehouse we purchased from the city of Des Moines. We raised a little over $8 million to buy it and historically preserve it. Inside, we have a full-scale culinary program, art gallery, Capes Cafe and Comic Book Shop is a for-profit tenant inside the space. We have a robust after-school program and classes for people of all ages. Annual graffiti festival out back. We bring 10 graffiti artists from around the country to change the walls every single August. The Come and Go Theater is a fully professional black box theater that's home to 4 resident theater companies. Malo Restaurant is a 7,000 square foot Latin-inspired restaurant that's also a for-profit tenant inside the space. We do circus and fire classes, which I believe Brooke will be offering later today. The basement music venue is under the theater, where we host 4 live music events every single week at least. And we have an outdoor music venue in the courtyard, where we were fortunate enough to have David Byrne from the Talking Heads come and give the keynote address when we first opened this building in 2014. So that is the Social Club. And I want to tell you a little bit about the story of the Social Club, and that is basically, how do you build community through the arts? That is the goal of the Social Club, and that's basically the goal of every single arts-based nonprofit in America. And that was our idea when we first started, but we had absolutely no idea what it meant or how to execute it, and how it related specifically to workforce development and economic development. And so I want to tell you a quick story about how we figured this out and how it relates directly to the work we do today in rural America. So when we first started, back in 2009, we didn't have the firehouse. We had this crappy building in downtown Des Moines. This building was held together by dirt. We were lucky enough to get a 1-year lease on this building. We got in there, we opened up a makeshift theater, a makeshift gallery, 2 classrooms, and a makeshift bar with a cabaret stage. And we started doing shows. And the first group that ever came to rent our theater was a group called 3X Wrestling. And they do WWE-style wrestling. And we never thought we'd have wrestling in our theater, but they had money and we said yes. So they started renting our theater every first Friday for their wrestling events, and as you might imagine, there are very specific types of people who come to see wrestling. On the same evening, completely coincidentally, in the bar, we booked a jazz and poetry night. And as you might imagine, there are very specific types of people who come to see jazz and poetry. These two worlds would never be caught dead socializing together. And that's exactly what happened. The first night, everybody came down, they went to the bar, they got a drink, they ran off in opposite directions. The second month, same thing. But the third month, something really interesting happened. And this was the kernel for everything the social club became and for the work that we do today. The wrestlers were on their intermission. And they were running into the bar and getting drinks and running back to the theater to avoid the poets because they're so scary. But there were these two guys, about 6'5", full leotards, standing 5 feet away from me, drinking a beer and watching the poetry. And they turned to me and they said, "Hey, are you the guy who runs this place?" And I said, "Yes." And they asked if they could talk to me in private. So we sat down in my office, I asked what I could do for them, and they said, "Hey, we'd like to get more involved." I said, "Great, we're a nonprofit, here's 10 different volunteer opportunities." And they said, "Yeah, we had something else in mind." And they looked around to make sure nobody was listening, and they whispered, "We both write poetry." And they asked to read their poems at the club, and I said, "Well, sure, it's an open mic, anybody can." And thus began our wrestling and poetry evenings. And so the following month, these two brave guys, they went, they wrestled, they came out, they got on stage, they read their poetry, which was actually pretty good, and they went back and wrestled some more. The following month, the people watching the wrestling came out to watch the poetry, at first to support their friends, and then they kind of got into it. 2 months later, the poets, encouraged by all this new behavior, said, "We should probably go check out what they do." They went into the theater to watch the wrestling, and they walked out saying, "That was awesome." 10 months in, we had to change the times of the programs so people could go to both. Now, this was 2008 in Iowa. And as our neighbor, you probably know about the Iowa caucuses. And the political conversations happening in that room until 2 in the morning were some of the most organic, natural conversations I'd ever heard in my life. People who were diametrically opposed on many issues, sitting there civilly having a discussion. And we stood back and we said, "This is it. How do we replicate this model every evening?" Now, I don't necessarily think minds were being changed, but relationships were being formed. And so today, the Social Club produces at least 2 different events every single evening that try and draw as opposite crowds as possible. And that's why they produce over 800 events and every single artistic discipline. The goal is something for every single person in the metro area of Des Moines at least once a month. And that's the goal of the Social Club. So, this is the work we do now in urban and rural. And to me, there's very little difference between these two worlds, and just like dealing with wrestlers and poets. Except these two worlds don't often sit down at a table and try to figure out things in a civil way. And I left the Social Club in 2015 to start the work that I do now in rural America. I started the creative placemaking department at McClure in 2017. Today there are 7 of us. There are 4 of us based in Des Moines, an office in DC, an office in St. Louis, and an office in Birmingham, Alabama. And these are the worlds that we play with. And what's been interesting is figuring out the economic development model. And creative placemaking at its core, most people believe it's just about arts and culture. And arts and culture is a big part of it. But it's also about how it drives economic development. And that old model that we keep playing with, and we talk to communities all the time, we ask them, does your community need more people? That's our big question. Do you want to grow? Most of the time they say yes, sometimes no, that's always interesting. But most of the time they say yes. And there's this myth about rural America, that there's no good paying jobs in rural America. And that's just not true. The reality is that there are many good paying jobs in rural America. There's just not enough people to take the jobs because those people leave. And that's been happening for 60, 70 years. And there's this old model of incentives for companies. This is the workforce development model that's been established for over 50 years. Let's try to get as much money as we can and give it to these companies to try to get them to our communities to move there and create jobs. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It has worked in many cases. But the problem is today, it doesn't matter how much money you give these communities. They're only going to come to your community if you have a downtown that looks like this. that has vitality. They're only going to move there if you have the talent pipeline. We just saw this play out with Amazon. There were dozens of other communities that offered way more money than the New York Metro and the Washington, D.C. Metro to Amazon. They were always going to go there. It didn't matter how much money they got. They also don't need the money. They wanted to go where the talent is. And the talent is only in places that have vitality. And that's what we do with creative placemaking to create that vitality. So, we also talk about this in terms of creating the unique. What's unique about your community? We have to figure that out. And when you ask young people what they want, what it's going to take for them to move to a community, I guarantee they're going to say one of these three things right off the bat. They're going to say they want mountains, they're going to say they want oceans, and they're going to say they want a professional sports team. Now, being that these three things are unlikely to happen in rural communities across the country, we have to move past that. These are the 5 places we play in. They want a cultural community. They want smart transportation. That doesn't necessarily mean public transportation. In most cases, public transportation makes zero financial sense in a small community. They want parks and walkability and great recreation. They want jobs. Jobs are important, but jobs are no longer the first, second, or third driver for a young person when they're deciding where they're going to live. And they want an entrepreneurial culture. If you can create these 5 things in your community, you're going to grow. So I talk a lot about that young community, but I break it down into these 3 sectors. 18 to 35, 35 to 55, 55 and up. And something we've learned, that first group, 18 to 35, that last group, 55 and up, those 2 worlds, they basically want the same things. They just do them at different times of the day. Everybody wants to go downtown and have a nice meal, have something to drink, hear live music, go shopping, walk on a trail. Some people do it between 4 and 8. Other people do it between 8 and 1 in the morning. It's people like me who's stuck at home with 3 kids. I don't get to leave the house anyway. I don't matter. It's that first and third group that we focus on. So, a lot of people want to go back to rural. We hear this all the time. People want to go back. They want to go back. They want to go back, but they're not. Why? What is stopping them? So here's what rural communities are up against. Childcare, first of all. The cost of childcare in most rural communities is more expensive than a mortgage or the rent people are paying on a monthly basis. Medical services. Hospitals are closing all across rural America. We see this all the time. I know this happened here in Illinois. It's happened a lot in Iowa. Happened all across the Midwest and the Mississippi Delta. Major, major issue. Dilapidated housing, dilapidated buildings, the opioid crisis, the drug crisis happening across the country, major barrier. Then we have this horrible thing. You've probably heard about food deserts before, where you can't get fresh food in a 10-mile radius. Now we have something called food swamps. A food swamp is a place that's already a food desert, but the only place to buy food are fast food restaurants and convenience stores. That's a food swamp. And unfortunately, there's a lot of rural communities that I go to on a regular basis that are food swamps. We have to fix that. These are some of the things that rural communities are up against. Not to mention that 46 states have lost population over the last couple decades. They're all moving to cities. And we see this political map, and the map that you showed earlier about Illinois. We see cities are blue and rural communities are red. That's not sustainable at all. We have to mix that pot. There's good ideas on both sides, and we need to move it together. So, we also have blinders on. How many of you have a building in your community that's been vacant or falling apart for many years, and you just drive by it or walk by it now and you don't even notice it anymore? I've seen this in dozens of communities across the country. And it's because you have blinders. You've lived there for a long time. You don't see it anymore. And it takes sometimes a neutral person or party to come into that community to help stir still waters. So we created this hierarchy of needs for rural communities. And it starts at the base with housing. And we realized a while ago that we can create as many coffee shops and cultural organizations and live music venues and daycare centers as we want, but if there's nowhere to live, what's the point? So we had to fix housing. Right above that, education, both public education and secondary education. That's a major concern in most of these communities. Quality of life and new amenities have to be created. High-speed internet. And some people refer to this as broadband. I think this is a marketing issue. A lot of people have no idea what broadband is. It's high-speed internet, let's call it that. But fiber to the home is incredibly expensive and doesn't typically make a lot of financial sense in small communities. And I know as electrical co-ops, some of you are considering becoming telecoms. Some of you have become telecoms. Some of you are acquiring telecoms or working with telecoms. It's a great idea. And we've created some really interesting ways to get fiber to the home or to do a wireless network and fix this high-speed internet crisis in rural America, because without it, it's an economic development crisis. We have to fix that. Medical services, as I mentioned, transportation, as I mentioned. If you can do all this work, that equals more workforce. That's where we're headed. This is a lot of work. And unfortunately, we can't pick and choose what we do. We can't say, well, we're going to work on the medical issue and we're going to work on the education issue. We'll get to the other stuff later. That doesn't work. You got to do it all at the same time. That's a heavy lift. That's the work that we do. So let's start with housing for a minute. Here's the basic housing crisis summed up. Wages in rural areas have either decreased or not kept up with urban areas. The cost of building goes up every year. The trades have left and moved to urban areas, so it costs more to bring them into town, and there's often few amenities there. You add all that up, you've got a housing crisis. Today, to build a one-bedroom apartment in anywhere in America, urban or rural, you're going to have to charge, on average, $975 for a one-bedroom apartment. How many of you can justify that in your community? Right. The average in rural America is $525 for a one-bedroom. That's a major gap. For single-family homes, the average valuation of a single-family home in rural America today is $72,000. But if you're going to build a brand-new three-bedroom, two-car garage house anywhere in America, today it's going to cost you about $185,000 to build it, which means you're going to sell it for over $200,000. That prices out many people in our rural communities. Another giant gap. So this is a financial problem. There's major demand, but there's not the financial issue to put it together. So we have to fix that, and that's some of the work that we do. When you look at amenities, what's going to be in the community? What are people doing? How are they recreating? Here's a list of things that cities with over 1 million people, they have all of these things. And this is exactly what workforces of all ages are looking for wherever they're choosing to live. Many of our rural communities have some or none of these. So I love this graph. This is a graph of microbreweries in America from 1887 to 2013. And as you can see, it spikes over 2,500 microbreweries in America by 2013. And what's interesting about this, if you've seen any Budweiser ad recently, they talk about what type of hops they use. Budweiser drinkers don't care what hops are in their Budweiser. They never have. But they're doing this because it's eaten into their market share. But what's even more interesting about this, only 3 years later, by 2016, the number doubled. Today, there's over 5,000 microbreweries in America. And I don't bring this up simply because drinking beer is fun. I bring this up because of the economic development model that a brewery can create in your downtown. It's happened 100 times over and shows no signs of stopping. And it's a great thing you can do in your community. When you think about artists and creatives and what they're looking for when they're just thinking about where they're going to live, here's a list of things that they're looking for right now. Many of these things are very inexpensive to create and will attract people to come in. These are some of the types of amenities that we need. New restaurants, new barber shops, new cultural centers. What can we do in our downtowns to revitalize it? I'm going to talk about that in a second. So now we need retail, which is really difficult. Here's the problem. Today, 67% of millennials buy most of their goods and services online. I purchased something in the elevator coming down here today. And I'm not even a millennial. I wish I was. No, I don't. This is today, 67%. That number's only going to go up. We cannot fight this. We cannot combat this and say, stop buying things online. That's not going to work. So what will work? Things that are localized. We call these things touch services. You can't get your hair cut online. You can't get your nails done online. You can't have a cultural experience online. You can't have dinner online, at least not yet. These are things that we call touch services that we can rebuild our main streets with. And not surprisingly, these are the things that help make communities unique. If you are opening a business that sells things that can be bought at a box store or online, it's unlikely you are going to succeed. And that's unfortunate, but that's the truth. But we can remake our main streets with things that complement who we are. We're seeing this in Murfreesboro right now. I just learned about half hour ago that they're getting a brand new coffee shop that's going to be roasting beans in this town of 8,000 people. That is a catalytic element. There are a few empty buildings on downtown Walnut Street in Murfreesboro that need new concepts, new ideas. And Brooke and many other people there are leading that charge. And I want to stress this point. and I'll talk about this again later, but money is never the problem. Leadership is. And I'll talk about where the money comes from. But it's because we have leaders like Brooke and many of her colleagues in Murfreesboro that are leading that charge that it's going to be successful. When we look at an empty building like this one, we immediately start thinking about what can we do with it, what can go in it. Second story and up, pretty easy, residential, that makes tons of sense as long as we can make the financial matter work. The first floors can become STEM training centers, medical services, grocery delivery systems, cultural centers, coffee shops, maker spaces, coding academies. What can we do that people have to go into physically and recreate the work? And it takes different revenue sources all coming together to make these programs work. And that's part of the work that we designed to build those business plans. You have to be multidisciplinary for what you offer to get all these ideas coming in. Cultural centers and nonprofits can't lead the way financially. We need other pieces that can complement that and play off of each other if we have lost leaders. That's what we create. So I want to talk about this. This is a forge. The first rural forge is opening it's August now, next month in Jefferson, Iowa, population 4,200. And a forge is a software development company. And they've decided that they want to open 27 of these across the country over the next 5 years. What they do is they move into a community. They immediately partner with the community colleges or the whatever college is there or the branch and the high school. They start training kids in 7th grade in how to code. And if you go through that program and you graduate high school, you're guaranteed a job after high school with a starting salary of at least $50,000 a year, right there at the forge in this rural location. If you want to go bounce to a different forge, you can move around the country. There's 4 of them in urban. This will be the first rural one. They want to open more over the next 5 years. This is a portal. There are 30 of these all around the world. This one is on the south side of Chicago. It's a gold shipping container. I went into this portal, the door was closed behind me, and suddenly I found myself talking to Remy. Remy is 19, and he lives in Iraq. And we had a 45-minute conversation about his life and my life, about what it's like to live in Iraq and what it's like to live in America. And it was absolutely fascinating. And it felt like he and I were in the same room together. I could have talked to somebody in Afghanistan. I could have talked to somebody in Denmark, somebody in Alabama, somebody in Copenhagen. All over the world, there are these 30 things. And they're built for cultural understanding and cultural awareness. People get together in them, and they have a meal together. They share a meal at the same time. These cost $20,000 to put into your downtown and are a catalytic element. People will come for this, and then what do they do after that? Where do they spend their dollars? This is Base Camp Coding Academy, my favorite one. Water Valley, Mississippi, population 3,500, just outside Oxford, where Ole Miss is. 2 people from a married couple from New England moved to Water Valley for a job, and instead they bought a bunch of buildings. He started serving on city council. They bought one building in particular. The first floor, she opened BTC Grocery Store and Cafe, and upstairs, he opened Base Camp. Base Camp takes 25 kids that graduate high school in northern Mississippi every year and puts them through a year-long boot camp. It costs $9,000 a kid, and it's entirely paid for by FedEx in Memphis and tech companies in Jackson. And all of those companies, when they're done that year, they guarantee those kids a job with a starting salary on average of $62,000 a year. No college. They go directly into the workforce. And that works for a lot of people, especially in rural communities. So these are some of the things and the partners that we work with to bring to a community. Here's a bunch of things that we create that I've been talking about that we can put into our downtowns right now. We have to make sure there's a financial model for it. This is where we're working today. We're mostly Midwest, Mississippi Delta. We just started projects this year, Pennsylvania, New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado. This is our wonderful team. We're very attractive. How do we pay for all this stuff? That's the big question. So I want to stress this again. Money is never the problem. There are trillions of dollars out there to pay for everything I just talked about and 100 more ideas out there if you're good enough to find it and persevere. It doesn't come easy. It'll take a while to get. But the money is there both in grants and donations and in normal financing. The problem is leadership. Does your community have the right leadership in place? At the city council level, at the county level, at the state level, in our business community, in our arts community, in our small business community, in our school system. When we go to work there, we asked communities to put together a steering committee. And the way we talk about it is, if your town is a high school, we want the head of every clique sitting at that table. Everybody there. And that's how we can move forward and actually make some of this work. Here's where the money comes from. I believe very much that every project should be both publicly and privately funded. However, I don't believe you should ever have more than 10% of public dollars in these projects, because that's not sustainable. We have to have viable business models that can work. And those dollars are out there. And as I said, there's trillions of dollars out there. We have to identify it and bring it in, and sometimes we have to create it. So now we need people. So we need to create incentives. We were doing one project in a town in Iowa where they were having a hard problem attracting and retaining high-quality public school teachers. The school district didn't have money to incentivize it, but they kept getting these kids that would graduate college and get their first job teaching there, and they would leave after 2 or 3 years to move on to a bigger market. And the number one reason why they would leave, if they were younger and single, they'd say, I'm young and single, I don't want to live here. I want to be in a place with more vitality. But it's chicken and egg. So we had to incentivize them to come and stay. So we created a housing project there that had 20 units of housing. We raised $20,000 on top of that. $10,000 came from the developer, $10,000 we raised locally. That was enough to do 4 teachers a year for 3 years. Here's how it worked. If you agreed to move there and become a public school teacher for at least 3 years and live in this building, we were going to underwrite your rent by $200 a month, and for every year you stayed, we would pay down your student loans $1,000 a year. Now, we didn't want to give them free money, so in exchange for that, they had to do community service hours that equaled the amount of dollars we were offering. So we helped embed them in the community. We're in year 3 of this right now. And so far, everybody has stayed. And the question is, how many of them are going to stay after 3 years? But if only 25% of them stay, if they stay in that community, they might get married, they might have kids. In Iowa, every kid is $6,000 into the public school system. They might buy a house, they're going to shop locally, they might start a business. I would argue that is better economic development than a $10 million tax incentive we could give to a company who may or may not create the jobs they say they will. Again, not that we shouldn't do that, but we can do both of these things, and this is faster and cheaper. It doesn't have to be public school teachers. It could be electricians, journalists, police officers, community college professors, veterinarians, pharmacists, whatever your community needs. We can create an incentive program to bring them in. And there are dozens of examples of this all around the country. If you get a job at BNSF Railroad right now in Kansas or Missouri, they're going to give you a $25,000 signing bonus today. Don't all run out of the room. If you move to rural Vermont today, the state of Vermont will give you $10,000 for free. As long as you live there. You don't even have to work there. You just have to live in rural Vermont. If you're a nurse, there are dozens of programs all around the country. Some of these will buy you a house, will pay for any schooling you need, will pay for schooling your children need. That's how bad the shortage of nursing is in rural America today. If you move to Marnie, Iowa, and buy land, they will give you that land for free if you build on it. There's a dozen programs like this all over the country. The question is, what can your community do? What kind of incentives can you create? You can get as original at this as you want. But these are the types of things that are going to attract people. Just like we pay companies to move to communities, now we got to pay people. We got to have people come. Otherwise, the companies won't be there. And it's a lot faster and less expensive. And we can create these incentive programs with you to figure out what that's going to mean. So I want to talk for a moment about Murfreesboro, we mentioned before. So these are the pieces that we're doing in Murfreesboro right now. As I mentioned before, there are several downtown buildings that are empty that we're trying to figure out what can we do with them. What businesses can we create to go into those buildings? Thankfully, right now, we've got a coffee shop already moving in. There's a dozen other ideas that we're playing with. A shared streets plan. This is basically putting a street on a road diet, creating viable bike paths and viable walking paths and parking, and slowing the speed limit down. And we work with state DOTs across the country on figuring out how can we drop the speed limit, which there are a dozen different studies out there that show that relates directly to economic development. Because if you're zooming into town, 30 years ago, 40 years ago when these towns were built, The streets were designed to get people into downtown as quickly as possible and out of downtown as quickly as possible. That doesn't create economic development. Nobody's stopping to shop. Nobody sees what's on the side of these roads. And that's why, a big reason why we've got empty storefronts. Wayfinding signage and public art. I hear everywhere I go, every community of 100 people and 50,000 people, everybody tells me we've got a parking problem. And basically it means if I can't park directly in front of that business, then I've got a parking problem. And most of these communities, they don't have a parking problem. They have a walking problem. People don't want to walk 2 blocks or 3 blocks. Most people will park at the way back of the Walmart parking lot and walk all the way up to the front without having much problem with it, as long as they can see their destination. So we need to give them a route to get there. You can do this with public art. You can make it safe with lighting, and you can have some fun with it. You could say, well, park here to get to downtown. It's a 2-minute walk. You're going to burn X amount of calories, and now you can get that extra cupcake at the bakery. How can you have fun with this as well as creating economic development? A citywide marketing plan. We heard time and time again as we did our visioning sessions in Murfreesboro, nobody knows, there's no central location online to find out what's happening in downtown. We have to create a centralized website and get that information out. And finally, housing. Housing is the biggest concern. How do we create more housing? How do we get developers to build? How do we take care of our blighted properties from low-income housing all the way up to market rate? And we're working through that process right now in Murfreesboro. I hope to invite you all to come there next year once this work is done and it's being implemented. And please help Brooke, because she's going to need help with so many other people. So, I talked a little bit about this before when we saw the state map of Illinois. And it's a pretty good representation of this issue, of political parties splitting urban, rural. This is not sustainable, and we need to move past that. These two worlds are going in these directions. So here's a map a friend of mine created in a book called American Nations. He divided the country up into 19 different mini-countries based on political ideology, and I think it's pretty darn accurate for how he made it. And it's a really interesting book. I encourage you to check it out, called American Nations by Colin Woodward. But we have to be thinking about American migration. Here's what's interesting. If you look at the coasts of our country, the east and west coast, they have swelled. Young people have moved there by the hundreds of thousands over the last 30 years. Every single city on those coasts today are oversaturated. And people are leaving. And they've been leaving over the last 20 years. So the last 20 years, where did they go? Minneapolis, Kansas City, Nashville, Austin, Denver. Today, those cities are oversaturated. That's what we're seeing. Here's a map of where they went between 2000 and 2007. I'm pretty sure that little pink square in the middle of Iowa represents me. There was no one else going there back then. So if this is true, this is an interesting trend that we're following, and this is our bet. If the coastal cities are oversaturated and the second cities are oversaturated, right now we're in the rise of third cities. Places like Des Moines, places like Springfield, Boise, Idaho, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Madison, Wisconsin, Little Rock, Arkansas, Birmingham, Alabama. These are the cities that are gaining population at similar levels as Minneapolis and Nashville did before it, and as San Francisco and New York did before that. 100 years ago, San Francisco was going through exactly this process. 60 years ago, Brooklyn was going through this process. This is not new. It's just speeding up. So we believe that by 2030, those third cities, the Des Moines of the world, will be oversaturated. And if that's true, what's left? That's where we live, in rural America. And we believe that wave is going to break and people are going to go, but they're only going to go to the communities that have the quality of life and housing options that this generation of workforce is looking for. So communities smaller than 50,000 need to prepare today for that process. This is really relevant. Whether you agree with the president or you do not, for the first time in 100 years, rural America elected a president. That's a really big deal. And I'm sure many of you have been seeing this lately. The spotlight is on us. Last night during the Democratic debates, and 2 years ago during the other debates, it was really rare before that you heard the words rural or you heard any issues about our communities being uttered from that stage unless you heard the word farm. Other than that, you didn't hear about the other issues that we see with electrical co-ops in these communities. So here's what urban thinks of rural. Here's what we're really up against. And I want to highlight this and see what you think of this. So here's an article that came out just before Christmas last year. The Hard Truths of Trying to Save the Rural Economy, on the front page of the opinion section on the Sunday New York Times by Eduardo Porter. And this article really got me upset. And I want to see if you guys have a similar reaction. So first of all, this guy starts out saying, I'm not from a small community, I don't know small communities, but I'm going to write this article anyway. So great start. Excellent, I'm already upset. Then he moves to this point, and he says, well, here's the thing. If we can't figure out what to do in these urban areas, well, I guess we have to just figure out how to rezone our housing so all these folks from rural communities can just move there. Which, of course, assumes that people from rural communities want to move to urban, which many of them don't. Then he gets to this point, and he says, well, if we can't figure it out, I guess we should just turn those areas back over to the bison. And that was one of the most insulting things I've heard as somebody who cares about rural America. And what's crazy about this is an issue called rewilding. This is a real theory that is now taking shape. It was a fringe theory. It's now taking shape on the front page of the New York Times opinion section. We're seeing this again and again. So here's the question. How do we respond to this? What are we going to do? How are we going to act? These are the questions we have to think about. Now, a couple weeks ago, there was this article that came out and basically said, hey, college grads, don't dismiss rural. Think about rural. Here's all the good reasons why. So there are good things to be thinking about with this. There are some responses, but these responses are being written by folks in urban areas and academics. They're not being created by us. We need to be writing and responding, and we have to be bold. So I was in Algona, Iowa, a town of 5,000 people, northern Iowa, almost on the Minnesota border. And I was interviewing this woman 2 years ago. And she said, well, here's the thing in Algona. We get things 7 years after Des Moines. And I said, that's funny, because in Des Moines, the joke is we get things 10 years after New York. So I said, wait a second, you get things 17 years after New York? And she looked me dead in the eye and she said, well, yeah, I mean, we just got hummus. And she was dead serious. She's like, have you tried hummus? It's really good. And I went back and looked, and around 2000 was when hummus hit most major grocery stores. It's bizarrely accurate. But this is the question. Why are we waiting 17 years for hummus? Why are we waiting 17 years for anything? There's this perception in rural America that because we're small, we don't get the good stuff. We get the leftovers after the urban areas do it. But that's not true. We can innovate. And I want to show you a few ideas on how to do that. How do we disrupt? Today, the biggest publishing company in the world produces no content, Facebook. The biggest hospitality industry in the world owns no properties, Airbnb. And the biggest transportation company in the world owns no vehicles, Uber. This is disruption. This is happening right now to us. And just because we live in smaller communities doesn't mean we can't do that ourselves. So what does that mean? How can we do that? I want to show you a picture of my car. I'm joking. This is a Mercedes. This is a driverless car. This is what it looks like inside. You're going to be able to work while commuting. Over the next 10 years, these are going to come online. But as you might have read about if you are interested in this, they're having a really hard time doing this in urban areas. But in rural communities, we have smaller populations. We have roads that need this type of work. Commute times are extremely high. Why not become a testing ground for driverless vehicles in these communities? We all know people that say, well, I want to live in this town, but I have to commute to the bigger city, or vice versa. I want to live in the bigger city for that quality of life, but I work in this rural location. This helps solve the problem, and eventually people don't want to drive that distance forever. It's going to be compacted. This is a 3D printed home. This house was printed in one day. It's 3,000 square feet, and it cost $50,000 to create. This is the machine that printed it. It's printed in concrete. You code it, you tell the machine how you want the house to look, and the machine spits out concrete in the way you told it to do it. If you Google 3D printed homes, you're going to see hundreds of videos about this. This is the world's first ever 3D printed office building. This is in Dubai. In Dubai, they believe it's going to be a $300 billion industry, and a quarter of their new buildings are going to be 3D printed out of concrete. This is what it looks like inside. It's like the Jetsons. Here are two 3D printed buildings side by side as models in China. The first is a 7,000 square foot mansion. Cost $161,000 to print, built in 1 month. Next to it is the first ever 3D printed residential tower. Also printed in a month, cost between $200,000 and $300,000 depending on who you talk to. I bring this up because no 3D printed building has been done for commercial or residential use in America. All of these things are happening in China, Russia, and the Middle East and parts of Europe. The reason why they're not happening in America yet is because the companies that are trying to do this are trying to do it in urban areas, and they're running up against unions, and they're running up against zoning. And it's going to take them about 10 more years to make that work. But in our communities, in rural communities, we don't have as many obstacles. We have major demand. We can take on this industry. This is a billion-dollar industry that we can do first. The question is your community ready for 3D printed buildings? If you are, talk to me afterwards. But these are the things that are going to frame the future. This is real disruption. This is how we can disrupt in rural communities. We have to prepare our communities for 30 years from now. Think about your town in 30 years. What does it look like? Who lives there? What do they eat? How do they get around? Where are they educated? Where do they work? What does your community look like in 30 years? And let's play to that, and let's build on that. Rural can innovate, and we can do that together. And I believe the future of rural America is the next place to pioneer, and that's the work that we need to be playing with. So, thank you so much for your time, and it was really an honor to be here with you today.